The morning sun rose slowly over Buckingham Palace, casting a golden glow across the gates and the wide courtyard. The air was cool, but the crowd was already gathering. People came from all around the world, excited to see the famous royal guards. Their bright red uniforms, polished buttons, and tall bearskin hats always drew attention. The guards stood like statues, their faces serious, their bodies still, their discipline perfect. Among them was Thomas, a young guard who had served for 3 years. He was proud of his duty, proud to wear the uniform that represented centuries of honor and service. Thomas stood silently at his post, his eyes fixed ahead, as tourists whispered, pointed, and took pictures. He heard the faint click of cameras, the rustle of clothes, and the soft shuffle of feet across the pavement, but he didn't move. To the world he looked emotionless, like stone, but inside he was alive, aware of every sound, every flicker of movement around him. He had learned that being a guard wasn't just about standing still. It was about representing respect, strength, and history, even in silence. Then, as his eyes scanned the crowd, something caught his attention. Near the edge of the barrier stood an elderly man. He wore a long coat that had once been military green but was now faded with time. On his chest hung several medals, their ribbons worn but carefully polished. His gray hair was thin, and his hand trembled slightly as he leaned on an old wooden cane. Thomas could tell at a glance that the man had once served. Soldiers recognize each other even when years have passed. The veteran was alone. People around him were chatting, laughing, or filming the guards, but no one seemed to notice the way his legs shook or how tightly he gripped his cane. Thomas could see the strain on his face, the quiet effort it took for him to remain standing. The man's eyes, though old and weary, still carried something powerful, a kind of pride that never fades, even when the body grows weak. As the ceremony began, the band started to play, and the guards moved in perfect rhythm. The tourists cheered softly, amazed at the precision of the march. But Thomas's attention stayed on the old man. The veteran stood straighter now, trying to match the guard's posture. Perhaps it was instinct, old habits from his service days. He lifted his chin, adjusted his shoulders, and for a moment he looked almost young again. Thomas felt a small pang in his chest, seeing the man fight to hold that proud stance. Minutes passed and the sun climbed higher. The crowd grew louder as more tourists arrived. A child dropped something and her parents laughed softly. Someone waved a flag. A group of people posed for photos near the fence. Yet amid the noise and excitement, the old man stood alone, shaking slightly as he tried to keep his back straight. Thomas could see him swaying, his hand trembling more each second. The man was trying hard, not for attention but out of respect. It was clear he wanted to stand for the ceremony, to honor the guards as one soldier to another. Thomas's training told him not to move. Royal guards are known for their discipline. They do not speak, smile, or break formation no matter what happens around them. It's a matter of pride. But as he watched the veteran struggle, a quiet worry began to build in his chest. He could see the man's knees weaken, his grip slipping on the cane. The guard's heart began to beat faster, though his body remained still. He hoped someone in the crowd would help. Maybe a passerby, maybe one of the security staff. But no one seemed to notice. A faint wind passed through the courtyard and the old man tried to shift his weight. The cane wobbled and his balance faltered. Thomas's breath caught for a moment. The veteran straightened again, breathing hard, his face pale. For a moment, Thomas thought he might fall. But he didn't. He stayed upright, clutching his cane tightly. The guard admired that strength, the quiet kind that doesn't need words. The kind of strength that comes from a lifetime of service, of battles fought and memories carried alone. The ceremony continued. The band's music echoed off the palace walls, each note crisp and proud. The sound stirred emotions in everyone who listened, but for the old veteran it seemed to reach deeper. His lips moved slightly as if he remembered the tune. Maybe it was a march he had once heard during his own service. Maybe it reminded him of friends long gone or parades from years past. Thomas saw a faint smile appear on the man's face. But the moment didn't last. As the crowd shifted to watch the changing of the guards, the veteran stepped forward for a better view. His hand slipped. The cane tipped sideways, clattering softly against the ground. The man tried to bend to pick it up, but his knees trembled violently. He froze, caught between pride and weakness. He didn't want to fall. Thomas's muscles tensed. He wanted to move, to help, but his duty held him still. His heart raced in his chest. Every instinct as a soldier told him to protect, to assist someone in need. The veteran took one shaky breath, his body wobbling again. The crowd still hadn't noticed. The guards around Thomas remained like statues. The old man's eyes flickered with frustration and embarrassment. He tried to bend again, slower this time, but his balance gave out. His cane rolled a few feet away. Thomas could see it all unfold as if time itself had slowed. The man's arms stretched out as he tried to steady himself, his metals glinting in the light. Thomas's jaw tightened. His training screamed at him to stay still, but his heart refused to listen. This wasn't a careless tourist or a prank. It was a man who had once worn the same kind of uniform, who had once stood proudly as Thomas did now. The guard's fingers twitched at his side. His mind replayed his own grandfather's face, a man who had served decades ago and who had taught him what real honor meant. Thomas had joined the guard to serve that same spirit of duty and respect. And now in front of him, that spirit was struggling to stay upright. The moment was heavy, silent, and stretched thin with emotion. Thomas's heart pounded harder as he saw the veteran begin to lose his balance again. The man's lips parted as if to ask for help, but no sound came. The guard could no longer ignore it. He didn't move yet, but every muscle in his body was ready. He stood straighter, his hand tightening near his rifle, his eyes locked on the man who reminded him what service truly meant. The band played on. The tourists laughed and pointed their cameras. The veteran's knees buckled slightly again, and Thomas knew that the next few seconds would change everything. He felt torn between two kinds of duty, the duty of a guard and the duty of a soldier. And deep down he already knew which one he would choose. He didn't move yet, but something in the air had shifted. The world around them was busy, noisy, unaware. Yet between the royal guard and the old veteran, there was a quiet understanding, one built on shared respect and silent strength. Both men stood beneath the same sun, both carried the same pride, and both knew that sometimes standing tall wasn't about rules, it was about heart. And in that moment, Thomas made a silent promise to himself. If the veteran fell, he would not let him hit the ground, no matter what the rulebook said. Because real honor, he thought, wasn't in standing still, it was in standing up for someone else. The moment came quietly without warning. The crowd around Buckingham Palace was full of laughter and noise, but for one man, the world had narrowed to a dizzy blur. The old veteran tried once more to straighten his back, his hand trembling as he reached for his cane that had rolled away. His legs refused to obey him. His breath grew short. He wanted to stay standing just a little longer. But his body had grown weak over the years, and the long minutes of standing in the cool morning air had drained his strength. Thomas, still at his post, could see it happening in slow motion. The veteran swayed once, caught himself, and then swayed again, harder this time. The cane slipped farther away. The people near him were too busy watching the guards march in perfect rhythm to notice what was happening at the edge of the crowd. Thomas's training told him not to react. Guards never move out of formation. But his heart told him something different. Then it happened. The veteran's knees gave out and he stumbled forward. His metals clinked softly against his chest. His hand reached out into the empty air, searching for balance that wasn't there. The world seemed to freeze for a second. Thomas's pulse jumped. Without a second thought, he broke his stillness. His boots hit the stone ground hard as he stepped out of formation. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The tourists turned, unsure of what they were seeing. A royal guard moving during duty? That never happened. But Thomas didn't care about the rules in that moment. All he saw was a fellow soldier falling. He moved quickly, his rifle tight against his chest, his red coat flashing in the sunlight. The crowd parted as he approached. In just a few long strides, he reached the veteran and caught him before he hit the ground. The man was light, frail, his hands cold. Thomas wrapped one arm around his shoulders and steadied him. The veteran blinked up at him, dazed and embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to stand," he whispered, his voice weak but full of pride. Thomas shook his head slightly, still holding him upright. "You already did, sir," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only the veteran could hear. For a few moments, the courtyard was completely silent. Even the band stopped playing. The tourists stood frozen, unsure if they should take pictures or stay quiet. Thomas's fellow guards didn't move. They stood as they always did, but their eyes followed the scene. The commanding officer, standing a few yards away, took one step forward, his mouth opening as if to give an order. But then he stopped. He saw the medals on the old man's chest, the trembling hand clutching at Thomas's sleeve, and he understood. The officer didn't say a word. He simply stood there, his face softening. Thomas helped the veteran straighten up slowly, keeping one hand on his shoulder to steady him. "Easy now," he said softly. The old man nodded, his breath shaky. He was embarrassed to have fallen, but Thomas could see the pride still burning behind his tired eyes. The crowd began to whisper. Someone said he helped him. Another person murmured, "He broke formation for him." Cameras started to click again, but this time not in amusement or curiosity. They captured a moment of quiet respect. The veteran finally stood upright again with Thomas's help. He tried to fix his coat and hold his cane, but his hand was shaking too much. Thomas reached down, picked up the cane, and placed it gently in the man's hand. Their eyes met for a brief second. It wasn't the look between a guard and a stranger. It was the look between two soldiers, one young and one old, bound by something that needed no words. The veteran tried to smile. "You lads, you remind me of what it used to feel like," he said softly, his voice filled with memory. Thomas could only nod. He didn't need to say anything. The band started to play again slowly, as if unsure whether to continue. The officer gave a small nod to signal that it was all right. Thomas helped the veteran take a deep breath, then guided him so he could stand facing the palace. The man lifted his head, his body trembling, but now he stood tall, his shoulders back, his chin up. Thomas stepped back slightly and gave him space. Then, without hesitation, he raised his right hand and saluted. It was a simple gesture, but it held weight. The tourists fell completely silent. The veteran stared for a moment, surprised, then tears welled up in his eyes. Slowly, he lifted his trembling hand and returned the salute. His arm wasn't steady, but it didn't matter. It was a soldier's salute, honest, proud, and full of history. The officer watched, saying nothing. The moment between the two men felt sacred, untouched by protocol or rules. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but for everyone watching, it felt like time had stopped. It wasn't just a young guard helping an old man, it was one generation of service honoring another. The crowd began to clap softly, unsure if it was allowed, but the emotion in the air was too strong to stay silent. One person started, then another, and soon gentle applause filled the courtyard. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. Others lowered their cameras, realizing the moment was bigger than a photo. Thomas helped the veteran move to the side, guiding him carefully toward a nearby bench. The medics stationed near the palace saw what was happening and came over. Thomas made sure the veteran sat down safely before stepping back to his post. The old man held his hand for a second before letting go. "Thank you," he whispered. Thomas gave a small nod and returned to his position. The officer met his eyes as he passed. There was no anger there, only respect. The officer didn't need to say anything. Rules were important, but compassion was greater. As Thomas stood back in formation, the ceremony continued. But something in the air had changed. The crowd's laughter had turned into quiet admiration. Even the guards seemed to stand taller, prouder. The tourists didn't just see soldiers in red coats anymore, they saw people, men with hearts and honor. The veteran sat on the bench, still breathing heavily but smiling faintly. He looked at Thomas standing firm once again, and in his eyes there was peace. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel old or weak. He felt like a soldier again. Thomas, though silent as ever, felt the same sense of pride warming his chest. He knew he might face questions later for breaking formation, but he didn't care. In his heart, he knew he had done the right thing. The uniform wasn't just a symbol of discipline. It was a promise to serve, to protect, and to show respect where it was due. Minutes later, the ceremony ended. The tourists began to leave, but many looked back at the young guard who had stepped out of line to help a fallen veteran. They whispered to each other, not about the palace or the changing of the guards, but about the moment they had just witnessed, an act of quiet kindness and deep respect. The old veteran stood once more with the help of the medics, ready to go home. Before leaving, he turned one last time toward Thomas. Their eyes met again from a distance. The veteran gave a slow nod, full of gratitude. Thomas replied with the slightest tilt of his head, a silent goodbye between soldiers who understood each other without words. The band finished its final tune, and the guards marched off in unison. But that morning, What everyone remembered wasn't the perfect formation or the shining brass instruments. It was the moment when one guard chose hard over rule and helped another man stand tall again. The courtyard was still. The sound of the band faded, and for a brief moment there was nothing but silence. It was as if the whole world had paused to breathe. Thomas stood beside the old veteran, his hand still lightly supporting the man's arm. The sun had climbed higher now, and a soft light shimmered on the metals across the veteran's chest. His breathing was uneven, but his eyes held a deep emotion that words could not express. Around them, hundreds of people stood in complete quiet, watching the two men, one young and strong, the other old and fragile, sharing a moment that reached beyond time and rank. Thomas had seen many ceremonies before, but none like this. The courtyard that was usually full of chatter now felt sacred. Even the officer who had started to step forward stopped in his tracks. He realized that this was not a mistake or a breach of protocol. It was something far more meaningful. It was respect in its purest form. The veteran slowly steadied himself, gripping his cane again. Thomas loosened his hold, making sure the man could stand on his own. The veteran took a small breath and straightened his back. His shoulders trembled, but he managed to stand tall. The look in his eyes changed. It was no longer the weary look of an old man. It was the gaze of a soldier remembering who he once was. Thomas adjusted his own posture and stood beside him. The two men, one in the bright red uniform of the present and one wearing the worn coat of the past, faced the palace together. For a moment they looked almost the same, two soldiers from different generations bound by one silent promise: never forget. Then, quietly, Thomas lifted his right hand to his brow and gave the old veteran a salute. The gesture was crisp and perfect, as every guard was trained to do. But this salute wasn't part of the ceremony. It was personal. It was for the man who had once stood where Thomas stood now, who had once given everything he had for his country. The veteran blinked in surprise. His eyes glistened. Slowly, with visible effort, he let go of his cane and raised his shaking hand to return the salute. His arm trembled in the air, but his hand was steady at his forehead. It was a salute filled with pride, gratitude, and the weight of memories that stretched back through years of service, friendship, and sacrifice. The two men stood like that, saluting each other in front of hundreds of silent onlookers. The sun caught the metal of the veteran's medals and the buttons on Thomas's uniform, making them shine. The air felt heavy with emotion, as if everyone watching could feel the history between them. One small boy near the front of the crowd whispered to his mother, "Why is he saluting the old man?" His mother, her eyes wet, replied softly, "Because he respects him." The silence continued. The band members, who had stopped mid-tune, stood still, their instruments lowered. The officer's expression softened. He didn't interrupt. He knew this moment would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. Even the tourists who came only for pictures now stood in quiet awe, realizing they were witnessing something truly special. The veteran's lips moved slightly, and Thomas leaned closer to hear him. "I thought no one remembered us anymore," the old man whispered, his voice filled with both sadness and relief. Thomas's throat tightened. "We remember," he said softly. "Always." The old man's eyes filled with tears. He blinked rapidly, trying to hide them, but it was no use. One tear slipped down his cheek, and the crowd saw it. In that moment, everyone seemed to understand what this meant. It wasn't just about one soldier helping another. It was about remembrance, about the link between past and present. Thomas lowered his hand, ending the salute, but the respect in his eyes remained. The veteran slowly lowered his trembling arm, his hand finding the cane again. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes after holding back years of emotion. "Thank you, son," he said softly. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone started clapping softly. It was just one person at first, but soon others joined in. The sound grew, echoing around the courtyard. Not loud, not chaotic, but gentle and heartfelt. People from all around the world, of all ages, clapped in respect. Some had tears in their eyes. Others simply bowed their heads. The officer didn't stop them. He let the moment unfold naturally. The veteran looked around, overwhelmed. He had not expected applause. His hands trembled as he leaned slightly on his cane again. He wasn't used to being seen this way anymore. For years he had walked through life unnoticed, another old man with memories no one asked about. But now, standing beside the young guard who had broken formation for him, he felt honored again. For the first time in a long time. Thomas helped him take a step back from the center of the courtyard. The veteran's legs were weak, but there was pride in every movement. Together they walked a few steps toward the side. As they moved, the applause slowly faded into quiet once again. When they reached the edge, a palace medic came forward to check on the old man. The veteran smiled and waved them off. "I'm fine," he said softly. "He already helped me." The medic smiled kindly and nodded, understanding. Thomas stood nearby, still silent, still watchful. The officer finally approached, his polished boots clicking softly on the stone. Thomas straightened his posture immediately, ready for whatever words might come next. But the officer didn't scold him. Instead, he gave a small nod and said quietly, "Well done, guardsman." Those words meant everything. Thomas saluted his officer, then turned his attention back to the veteran. The old man looked tired but peaceful now. His face, once full of strain, had softened. He looked like someone who had finally let go of a heavy burden. "Do you need help getting home, sir?" Thomas asked gently. The veteran chuckled weakly. "I'll manage," he said. "But I'll never forget today." Thomas nodded. "Neither will I." The old man reached out his hand and Thomas took it. His grip was weak, but his palm was warm. They shook hands, not as guard and visitor, but as brothers in arms. Then, the veteran turned slowly toward the palace one last time. He straightened his back as best as he could and stood tall, his silhouette outlined against the sun. Thomas returned to his position in formation, but something inside him had changed. The stiffness of duty felt lighter now, as if he carried something deeper, a sense of pride that came from doing what was right. His heart beat steady, not from fear or tension, but from peace. The crowd slowly began to move again, whispers spreading like ripples on water. People spoke softly to each other, not wanting to break the spell of what they had seen. Some said it was the most beautiful thing they had ever witnessed. Others said it reminded them of their fathers or grandfathers who had served long ago. The veteran stayed for a few more minutes, sitting on the bench nearby, watching the guards continue their ceremony. When the band began to play again, he smiled. It was the same march he had heard decades earlier when he was young and full of strength. The sound filled his heart with pride once more. Before leaving, he looked one last time at Thomas, who was back in perfect formation. Their eyes met briefly across the courtyard. The veteran gave a small salute with 2 fingers. And though Thomas couldn't move to respond, the faint smile on his face was enough. As the veteran walked away with slow, steady steps supported by his cane, the crowd parted for him. Some nodded, some smiled, and some clapped softly once more. The old man left the palace that day not just as a visitor, but as a hero remembered. And for Thomas, the young guard who broke the rule to honor an old soldier, that morning would live in his heart forever. He didn't just help the veteran stand. He helped the whole world remember what respect truly means. The soft sound of applause still lingered in the air when Thomas returned to his position. The courtyard was no longer filled with chatter and laughter. It was quiet and thoughtful now. People looked at the young guard and the old veteran with a kind of respect that couldn't be faked. Cameras had captured every second, but the moment itself had gone beyond photos. It was something people could feel deep in their hearts. The tourists who had come only to see the changing of the guard were now whispering about the young man who had broken formation. They weren't talking about rules or protocol. They were talking about kindness, about humanity, about the beauty of one man helping another without hesitation. For many of them, it was the first time they saw the Royal Guards not just as soldiers, but as people, strong, disciplined, and still full of heart. The veteran sat on the bench nearby, his eyes fixed on Thomas, who now stood straight and proud again. He could still feel the young guard's firm hands that had lifted him when his legs failed. Every breath he took now was slower but easier. He felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of years had been lifted off his shoulders. The smile that had once disappeared from his face had returned. A small girl standing with her parents pointed at the veteran and whispered, "Mom, is he a hero?" Her mother smiled softly and said, "Yes, sweetheart," and that guard helped everyone remember it. Thomas could hear bits of the crowd talking as he stood motionless again. Someone said, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Another voice replied, "He didn't think twice, he just did the right thing." A man nearby, clearly emotional, wiped his eyes and said quietly, That's what respect looks like. A few reporters who had been filming the ceremony were now writing furiously. They had come to cover a simple royal event, but what they witnessed was something far greater. Within hours, the photos and videos would travel across the world, across screens, newspapers, and hearts. But Thomas didn't know that yet. He only knew that he had done what felt right. The air around him felt calm, almost sacred. Even the officer who had watched the whole scene stood a little taller now. There was no anger, no disapproval, just quiet pride. The band began playing again. The music filled the courtyard, but this time it sounded different, softer, more meaningful. The tourists didn't cheer loudly like before. They listened. The old veteran lifted his head and tapped his fingers lightly to the rhythm. It was a march he recognized. It took him back to his younger days, to the parades, the flags, the laughter of his fellow soldiers. Memories came flooding back. Some painful, some joyful, but all precious. He looked at Thomas once more, standing at attention in his bright red uniform. A memory stirred inside him of the day he had been young like that, strong, disciplined, proud to serve. It made him emotional, but it also filled him with hope. He thought, if young men like that still serve, then our country's heart is still strong. After a while, the officer quietly walked over to where the veteran sat. He spoke gently. "Are you all right, sir?" The old man nodded with a tired smile. "Yes, son. Better than I've been in years." The officer smiled too. "You made quite an impression out there." The veteran chuckled softly. "No, lad. It was your guard who did. I was only trying to stand. He helped me remember I still can." The officer's eyes softened and he gave a respectful nod. He did the right thing. That's the kind of man we hope all our soldiers grow to be. Meanwhile, across the courtyard, a group of tourists had started to record short messages about what they saw. A young woman from Canada said into her phone, "I came to see the palace, but I ended up seeing something that touched my heart. A guard broke formation to help an old soldier. It wasn't part of the show, it was real." Another visitor from Japan said quietly, "It was a moment of honor. Between two people who understand service." Everywhere people turned, they spoke in low voices, sharing their thoughts, their admiration. The video clips began spreading online before the ceremony had even ended. Within minutes, people from around the world began to comment, "Respect. This is what real strength looks like." He stood for the right reason. Back on the bench, the veteran watched the crowd. His eyes moved slowly across the faces of strangers who now looked at him with admiration. For years, he had walked through life unseen. Today, because of one small act of kindness, he felt truly seen again. A young boy came closer, holding a small flag. "Sir," he said shyly, "thank you for your service." The veteran smiled warmly and took the boy's small hand. "And thank you for remembering, young man." Thomas, still at attention, noticed the exchange from a distance. His lips didn't move, but inside his heart swelled. He could see how one small action had changed the mood of hundreds of people. He didn't need medals or praise. The sight of that old man smiling again was enough reward for him. The ceremony drew to an end. The guards began to change formation again. Every move was precise, every step measured. Thomas followed the commands perfectly, as if nothing had happened. But everyone watching knew things were different now. The uniform no longer hid the man inside. It revealed his humanity. When the final notes of the band faded and the ceremony was complete, the crowd broke into applause once more. Not for the performance, but for the people. The officer gave a subtle nod, allowing Thomas and the other guards to step back from their positions. As Thomas moved toward the palace gate, he glanced at the veteran one last time. The old man saw him and lifted his cane slightly like a soldier raising his sword in salute. It was small but powerful. Thomas stopped for a second, gave a slow nod in return, then continued marching with his unit. After the ceremony ended, the veteran stayed seated for a while longer. A gentle breeze brushed against his face. He felt at peace. When he finally stood, one of the palace staff offered him a hand, but he refused politely. "I can manage now," he said with a quiet smile. And he did. He rose slowly, using his cane, and stood as tall as he could. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. He looked one last time toward the guards standing proudly by the gates and whispered softly, "Thank you, son." By that evening, the story had already spread. News channels played the video. Millions watched as Thomas stepped out of line to catch the falling veteran, helped him stand, and saluted him with respect. People around the world praised the guard's action. Social media filled with words like honor, compassion, and dignity. But the guard himself didn't seek any of it. He was just doing what his heart told him to do. The next morning, when Thomas reported for duty, the officer gave him a quiet smile. "You've made the nation proud, guardsman," he said softly. Thomas simply nodded and went back to his post. For him, the best reward was knowing that an old soldier walked away smiling again. Days later, a small letter arrived at the palace addressed, "To the guard who helped me stand." It was from the veteran. In the letter, he wrote, "You didn't just help me stand, you helped me remember what it felt like to be a soldier again. You reminded me that respect never grows old. Thank you, lad. You helped me stand tall once more." Thomas read the letter quietly, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket. He stood at his post once again, tall, steady, and proud, and somewhere in the crowd, unseen by all, the old veteran smiled and walked with his head held high. That day, every person who witnessed the moment carried it with them. Some told their families, others shared it with strangers, but they all remembered the same thing. One man's kindness can restore another man's pride. The world had come to see soldiers who never move. But what they saw instead was a soldier who moved because his heart told him to, and that made everyone around him stand taller too. The sun began to set behind Buckingham Palace, painting the sky in shades of gold and soft pink. The courtyard was almost empty now. The tourists had left, the band had finished, and the echo of footsteps had faded into the distance. Only a few guards remained on duty, standing tall and silent as ever. Thomas was among them, his uniform as perfect as when the day began, but inside him something had changed. He could still feel the warmth of the old veteran's hand, the weight of that moment when he helped him stand, and the quiet gratitude in the man's eyes. After his shift ended, Thomas walked slowly across the courtyard, his boots tapping lightly on the stone ground. The day's event kept replaying in his mind. He didn't do it for attention or praise or any kind of reward. He had moved because his heart had told him it was right. That thought alone filled him with quiet pride. When he reached the barracks, a few fellow guards looked up from their seats. One of them said softly, "You made the news, mate." Thomas raised an eyebrow, confused. Another guard showed him his phone. On the screen was a photo of him catching the veteran, holding him up as the crowd looked on in silence. The headline read, "Royal Guard breaks formation to help old soldier stand again." Thomas blinked in surprise. "The news?" he said quietly. "Yes," another guard said with a smile. "Everywhere. People can't stop talking about it." He didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to attention. Royal Guards were trained to blend into ceremony, not stand out. But as he read the comments under the video, he felt humbled. There were thousands of messages, people from different countries thanking him, veterans writing words of respect, children saying they wanted to be like him. One message stood out. "You didn't just help a man to his feet, you helped the world remember kindness." Thomas closed the phone gently. Fame didn't matter to him, but the idea that people were touched by the moment did. He hoped the old man had made it home safely. He hoped he was resting, smiling, and proud again. That night, he couldn't sleep easily. He kept thinking about the veteran's words. "You reminded me I still can." Those words played in his head over and over, each time making him think about what it really meant to serve. Being a soldier wasn't only about guarding walls or following commands. It was also about carrying respect and compassion for those who had come before. The next morning was calm. The palace courtyard was bright again, and tourists were already gathering for another ceremony. Thomas stood ready in formation, his mind focused, his posture perfect. But inside, he carried a deeper sense of purpose. The officer walked past him, stopped briefly, and whispered, "The king himself heard about what you did." "Well done, guardsman." Thomas didn't move, didn't smile, but inside his chest filled with pride. A few days later, a small envelope arrived for him. It had no official mark, just a neat handwriting that said, "To the guard who stood with me." Thomas opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter and an old photo. The letter read, "Dear young man, I wanted to thank you properly. That day I wasn't just losing my balance, I was losing faith in myself. My body isn't what it used to be, and sometimes I feel forgotten by the world I once served. But when you stepped forward and caught me, You didn't just lift me up. You reminded me who I was. You helped me stand not only on my feet but in my spirit. That salute you gave me, it meant more than you'll ever know. Thank you for seeing me not as a weak old man but as a soldier still worthy of respect. With deep gratitude, Arthur Bennett, Royal Army veteran, Sign 52, 1974. At the bottom was a small photograph of a much younger Arthur, smiling proudly in his uniform beside his fellow soldiers. Thomas looked at the photo for a long time. The face was younger, but the eyes were the same, strong, determined, and kind. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his locker. From that day on, before every shift, he would look at that letter for a moment just as a quiet reminder of what his uniform truly stood for. Weeks passed, and the story didn't fade. Newspapers printed articles about the guard who broke formation for honor. Veterans groups sent letters of appreciation. Schoolchildren wrote him messages. One little girl drew a picture of a guard helping an old man with the words, "Be kind and brave like him." It made Thomas smile softly every time he saw it. But beyond all the attention, what touched him most was when one day, during another ceremony, he saw Arthur again. The old man came walking slowly through the crowd using a new cane this time. He was steadier, his back a little straighter. He wore his medals proudly, and his face glowed with quiet confidence. When the ceremony ended, Arthur waited near the gates. As the guards marched past, Thomas saw him and felt a warmth spread through his chest. For a moment, their eyes met again. Arthur raised his hand and gave a small salute. Thomas, though he couldn't break formation, blinked once and slightly lifted his chin, his silent acknowledgement. Arthur smiled and stood there for a long time, watching the ceremony he had once loved. The crowd around him didn't realize who he was, but Thomas did. And that was enough. Later that day, after duty, Thomas walked toward the outer gate and Arthur was still there. The old man grinned as the young guard approached. "Still standing tall, I see," Arthur said. Thomas smiled softly. "Because you reminded me why we stand, sir." Arthur chuckled. Then we helped each other. They stood for a while, watching the palace in silence. The air carried a calm stillness, the kind that makes moments feel endless. Tourists passed by, unaware of the quiet bond between the two men. Before leaving, Arthur extended his hand again. "Take care, son. Keep standing for what's right." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "Always, sir." Arthur walked away slowly, but his steps were stronger now. He moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had found his strength again. Thomas watched him go, feeling proud, knowing that their lives had touched in a way that would stay with both of them forever. As weeks turned into months, that moment continued to live on. People still shared the story online. They called it the day kindness broke formation. School teachers told their students about it. Veterans spoke of it with tears in their eyes. Even young recruits heard about the guard who chose compassion over protocol. It became a lesson in every training room that true strength is not only in obedience but in humanity. And Thomas? He kept serving day after day, always standing tall, always alert, always ready to act if needed. But deep inside, he carried something stronger than duty. He carried the memory of one small act that showed the world what honor really meant. Sometimes, when the sun set behind the palace and the day turned quiet, he would glance at the place where it all happened, the spot where he had caught Arthur before he fell. The light always seemed to hit that place just right, as if the world itself remembered. He would stand there perfectly still, but his heart would whisper, "That's why I serve." And somewhere, maybe sitting by his window with a cup of tea, Arthur would look at a photo of the guards at Buckingham Palace and smile proudly. His body might be weaker, but his spirit stood tall once again, because one young guard chose to move when the world expected him to stand still. Because sometimes, a single act of kindness can make two men and the whole world stand taller.